There's times for resting. There's time for mindfulness. There's time for vulnerability, which is strength, and talking to somebody.
We're here. We're peaceful. We have things to say. You have to listen to us.
It's the right time to speak loudly in sports. The time is it's just screaming at us right now. There's no choice. There's no other way.
We're experiencing a moral reckoning with racism and systemic injustice that has brought a new coalition of conscience to the streets of our country, demanding change.
You know, it's often said that change is the only constant in life, and change we have seen lately. This week, a daughter of Oakland, as she calls herself, Senator Kamala Harris, became the first black and South Asian woman to become part of a major party ticket in the presidential race. Now, whether you agree or not with her, this is a historic moment. It may even change history. This is our fourth Race in America conversation, and over the past few weeks, we have watched and listened as change happened around us. But for some, change hasn't happened fast enough. 5 months ago today, this woman, Breonna Taylor, she was killed in her own home by Louisville police, serving a no-knock warrant. More than 150 days later, and still, none of those officers involved have been charged. So when we talk about change and justice, the case of Breonna Taylor really raises a question about those involved and why have they not been held accountable? Is her race behind this action or lack of it? And a good evening to you. I'm Marcus Washington. Now we're going to explore both that and the reason people are finding ways to celebrate the changes that we are seeing.
Good to be with you again, Marcus, and good to be with you. I'm Jessica Aguirre. Really, such a dichotomy at this juncture in our modern history, an unresolved, painful issue that we're talking about, and yet a sign of progress, both involving black women. So where do you stand on this issue? Are you hopeful, or is there such a long way to go? We want you to be part of this conversation tonight, so we want to bring in our Chris Kimura, who's been tracking your comments and your questions. Chris, what do you have?
Hey there. You know, so every episode we ask you for your comments and your questions, and you deliver. So thank you first for that. We are streaming live online, and right below the video window, you can share your thoughts or post your questions. In the lead up to tonight's show, we've heard from several viewers. Here are a couple of them. Let's start with J.C. Allen in San Jose, who simply says, put aside all the rhetoric and the name calling and realize that although this is a huge undertaking, it is possible to minimize the problems and destruction and work together. Next, some thoughts from Gilroy and Sean, who writes about Black Lives Matter. He says he 1,000% disagrees with BLM. He says all lives matter equally. No one ethnicity matters above any other. If Martin Luther King were alive today, he says, Sean believes that MLK would be ashamed of this movement. Let's move on to Junior in Fremont, who asks why the conversation is largely black and white. He writes here, as we speak of racist behavior, we have to look at more than just white and black people. I've seen just as much racism from people from India and Asia. I think what Junior might be saying is that more people need to be part of the conversation. It's my takeaway here that no one's excluded from the conversation. What do you guys think?
So I totally agree with that. I think that there are so many minority communities within America where you see and they face discrimination. We've seen it right here in the Bay Area where we saw, you know, Asians sitting at a restaurant. Yeah, so we do see that, and I think this is a bigger conversation, and I think this conversation will grow beyond just black community in this conversation. But
I think that's why you've also seen so many other minorities of color coming into this movement right now, the Black Lives Matter movement, because they've been sitting silently sometimes saying, you know, we've saw it with Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, and we've seen it with Latinos for years, you know, this class system, and, you know, we see it across the board. So I think that Black Lives Matter movement has folded in a lot of other minorities, but now they're starting to say, okay, we'd like to have our voices included a little bit more and make the landscape maybe so that we can talk about the issue of racism across the board with all of us.
Absolutely, because you and I have spoken about for both of our communities, and some of the things that we face, the disparities, are pretty much the same.
Pretty much the same. And when we start to focus on the things that are pretty much the same, we do have a louder voice.
We do. And speaking of voices, you know, from statues to sports, race continues to be a vocal point in America, leading to change and calls for justice. On our way down the long road of history, we collected heroes and idols. They're carved in stone, cast in bronze, on pedestals across the nation. But But a nation marching forward is now looking back through a different lens.
Sir Francis Drake, this great man was a murderer.
From Columbus to Junipero Serra, John Muir to Sir Francis Drake, some are no longer willing to overlook misdeeds of the past, leaving empty pedestals in their wake.
This symbol of racism had to go, and today we're standing in victory.
Where the coronavirus pandemic puts things on pause, the death of George Floyd sets things in motion. It's exposed the disparity blacks face on the job, in housing, and as victims of police violence. In an effort to change that trajectory, cities like San Francisco are now moving forward with plans to defund police.
We will redirect $120 million from law enforcement to support these priorities.
In the meantime, cries for justice for Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have only grown louder.
We are dedicating this season to Breonna Taylor.
As pro sports teams from the NBA to MLB to the National Hockey League taking a knee for racial justice, the WNBA and celebrities drawing attention to Taylor, the emergency medical technician killed by Louisville police in an accidental raid. Oprah Winfrey took out 26 billboards for Taylor, the number of years she lived on this earth. Amid this firestorm for racial justice, the nation said goodbye to lines of that cause. Minister C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis. Give us a vote! Men who not only walked that long road of history, they left behind a roadmap of where it should travel next.
We have a distance to travel. Be blessed. Be engaged. Be involved.
Certainly a message that can be taught across the board, and we certainly hope Congressman Lewis' legacy is taught in history classes. So should teachers be reconsidering how history, black history for that matter, is taught following the death of George Floyd, global protest, and this week, Kamala Harris making history? Well, Professor James Taylor, chair of the Department of Politics at USF, joining us now to talk more about that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's talk about Senator Harris there. Were you surprised at Joe Biden's pick for his running mate? I mean, a lot of people were hoping this might be the pair, but were you surprised by this?
She was always number 1 or 2 with Elizabeth Warren, but there was so many other people, even some that weren't well known or stated. Out of 12 people, we focused on the African-American women, but the reality is it could have gone in any direction. I think certain things that happened at the last minute more recently in the general politics of the country influenced this decision, and Joe Biden, his administration, and his team determined that Kamala Harris meets so many different needs for these times on so many different levels. And I think many people want to hold her local law enforcement record against her, and they forget that she's gone up to the Senate level and done a lot of amazing things with the prosecuting Barr, prosecuting Kavanaugh, and others. And so I think people have to weigh Kamala Harris in balance. I don't think you can only see the negative, and there's a whole lot of positive there. And now that she's freed from the obligations of law enforcement, you see a whole nother person emerging. And she's now speaking to those issues. Karen Bass was talking earlier about the two of them working together on policy. It related to young people in different juvenile situations and also in the foster care system. So that is some of the things she's done that are less well known. And a lot of people are focusing on some of the negative cases that are inevitable when you're overseeing a large metropolitan area. She herself had to take on some of the responsibilities of her assistant DAs and protect them behind her, even if she disagreed. So she's taken on a lot of weight locally.
So do you think that what
some of
happened
it
in the
is
past,
deserved,
or what she's been doing recently or within the last years that she's been a senator, will kind of combat what she's done in the past or what has happened in the past?
Well, I think you know, we're only in the first 24 hours of this thing, but I think there's going to be an evolution as to how this is seen. And as people begin to talk more and more over the next 80 days, they're going to see that she's going to have to go out on the ground as best as she can under the circumstances and make a case that she is the best position, given her law enforcement background and the obligation she has to the movement that ushered her into this position, to make some change. So they didn't put her there just to be seen. They want her to use her influence to try to get reforms in these important areas.
And I want to talk about, I know you mentioned earlier, black women as part of this. I know a lot of times when you have a first involved in an election, sometimes it galvanizes a lot of people. Do you think race, gender, going to play a big role in this election?
I think it will, because the president, that's his thing. That's all he has left. But I think with all of that's happened since the midterm elections, as a political scientist, I'm paying attention to what happened in the midterm elections. Women are the key to winning. In the midterms, 98% victories were to women against men, heads up. Elizabeth Warren said this in the debates, that the women up here hadn't lost. So having a woman at this time, and then having one with a law enforcement background who can then say, inside I can make some change, whereas when I was the DA, I had to enforce the law, and she can explain those differences. And I think there's a lot of goodwill for her in a lot of areas in the African-American community, in different communities. Here throughout this California, the state of California, she's won this state multiple times, which required her to be appeal to many different groups. She's beat a Latina in California, head to head for the Senate seat. So she appeals to a wide, in fact, she won the Latina vote in California against Loretta Sanchez.
And James, I want to talk to you about something too.
A wide array of people.
Absolutely. I want to talk to you about the birther theory. It's back. We saw it. Then President, now President Trump was saying that about Barack Obama, whether he was born here in the United States. We're seeing the same thing with Senator Harris now. But we know she was born right here in the Bay Area in Oakland. So when you hear those questions surface again, would you call this racist?
Yeah, and I think she should remind the president that what they have in common is they're both second-generation Americans. So he's not that long here himself, his family either. And I think you're going to see a lot of this kind of nativism and xenophobia, but we've all seen it already. And it's so tired, it's been played for the whole time. So, and it's not working anywhere except where it's already there. So I don't think he's expanding his base, and that is devastating to his reelection because the country is diversifying. You have women mobilized, you have African-American women mobilized, you have African-American men mobilized. So there's a lot of energy in the electorate, and I think the president has a lot to be concerned about.
And before I let you go, I want to talk about some things. We've seen a lot of statues throughout the country. George Washington, Christopher Columbus, John Muir, Sir Francis Drake. They're being either removed, they're by their names, whether the statue, the street names, all disappearing now. What do you say about this? Is this something that we're going to be talking about for years to come? Are we going to see more of this?
Absolutely. As long as we continue to have these kinds of incidents where you see these outbreaks of people's demands for accountability, you're going to see these unexpected and unpredictable turns. Martin Luther King called it the zeitgeist, being caught up in the spirit of the times. That's Bree Walker up on the South Carolina Confederate pole. It just takes on a life of its own. And we've seen this happen all over, from marketing to schools to freeways. And here in the state of California, when people really look at the issue, they can Google and see. All over the place, there are monuments from the 1840s when they came, some of the Southerners came from the California Gold Rush, and they were pro-Confederate, and they dominated LA. And then there was also this whole second wave with the Civil Rights Movement. So in the 1860s, 1840s, 1860s, and then in the 1960s, in a reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, to the Civil Rights Movement, a new wave of monuments were created by a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They had 14 chapters here in California, and they put them all over the state. So they're all over us. And we just saw Columbus's statue go down. We just saw the statue go down in front of City Hall called Early Days. And so these are monuments to these colonial and imperial moments, and there's a reckoning happening in America. All of it is on the table. People are even talking about going after the founding fathers.
And you, like you said,
and these are real
the spirit.
Conversations that people are going to have.
Yeah, so like you were saying, the spirit of the times. Now, before we let you go, I want to talk about a question
the spirit of the times
that we just got. This was from someone named Sean, a viewer, and he was talking about all lives, Black Lives Matter. In this situation, he says he doesn't agree with it at all. Break that, if you can break that down for us, because I mean, we've talked about it here a lot.
I think anybody having that conversation is not worth talking to. I don't think anybody who's having that conversation is serious at this point. It's been vetted. We've been having it for years. And we're still talking about that. That's someone trying to distract you. And Toni Morrison said, people like that, they keep you busy responding to them. I don't think we should respond to somebody still asking the question about blue, black, white lives when people are dying on TV. If people have that kind of confusion, then they need to sit down and talk to other people around them and figure out how they can get a better understanding. But the idea that we are going to, in 2020, when we've been at this since Oscar Grant died, for 11 years in Oakland, and then over in San Francisco with Mario Woods. And now here in 2020, after George Floyd, you want to have a conversation about blue and black and white lives? It's a waste of time. And I don't think anybody should spend their time talking to someone who's thinking about that, because they're not trying to learn. They're trying to keep you responding to a distraction, which is what is being done at the national level of government. Right, so I just don't think people who are serious should waste their time with this. And I think if you want to be, facetious, you could look at the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. And what did that mean to black people? That all men were created equal. All lives did not matter when all men were created equal. So I think we have to understand that there are specific injuries that the African American community has experienced, and it's also true. Jennifer Eberhardt over at Stanford has demonstrated through her research that American whites are disproportionately shot, like the president said recently, compared to whites anywhere else on the planet. And they don't realize it in terms of that reality with them being shot. So when the president said that, in terms of law enforcement, no other country in the world has 500 white people be shot on a yearly basis, or are as incarcerated as long, or are as punished as American whites are. So this system is not just affecting African Americans disproportionately, it is affecting every group. And when you look, for example, at the number 6 cause of homicide in America amongst young American men, it's law enforcement shootings. That's for all, black, white, Asian, Arab, everything in between. So it is a problem for all groups.
And we all need to step back
and instead of us having this blue, black, white lives conversation, we need to deal with those realities.
Yeah, stepping back, taking a look at all of this. We had Garza on here, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. She says, until you can say Black Lives Matter, all lives don't matter. So, that's something to think about in this moment.
Yeah,
James Taylor, I want to thank you.
And that's always been understood.
Yeah, that it has. Well, look, James, I want to thank you.
Frederick Douglass and others felt like if African Americans can get justice, then everybody can get justice.
And you know
and that's what the whole idea of the Declaration is to them. They've held on it for 150 years because where it says, we hold these truths that all men are created equal, that incorporates them. And for that reason, that's been the most important legal document in African American history, is the Declaration of Independence. It's at King's I Have a Dream speech. It's at Obama's inauguration. It's in the Panthers' 10-point plan.
And you know what it is? I know you were talking to me earlier. You said you had like 300 years of information and you just like to talk. Well, look, we're running out of time. But you know what? You've given us so much to think about. And I want to thank you, James. James Taylor, Chair of the Department of Politics at USF.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I used to be the chair, ex-chair. I don't want to get in trouble. Ex-chair.
Okay, ex-chair. But still, 300 years of information. Yep. All right.
We could have Professor Taylor talk to us for an hour. It was
so
fascinating and interesting. He had so much information to give us. I'm going to have to replay that whole interview again.
Yeah, I'm telling you, we were on the phone, and I told him, I said, look, you schooled me on so much that I didn't know. He was saying names. I had to look up names.
That was phenomenal.
I mean, just so much.
So much context.
Absolutely.
And for us to really grapple with and learn about, and just so many historical points that many of us just don't even know.
We don't.
So that was fantastic. Well, she's a doctor, she's a winemaker, and she's black. The Bay Area businesswoman who sees racial and social disparities in both those industries and how she plans to change it. That's next.
This is actually my first ever protest, but I'm really happy to be here. Too many people are being killed and too many people are being treated unfairly, and there's history repeating itself from hundreds of years ago, and it's like, we need justice, we need to bring justice now, because if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it?
That's right. Well, highlighting the voices of Black Lives Matter protesters, our digital video journalist, Jonathan Bloom, he's gathered their stories, and you can watch them right after the show or even during our commercial break. What you can do, pick up your phone, and I want you to point it to the QR code at the bottom left screen of the corner there of the screen, right there, and you can find out all of that. You'll see all of the video essays that we have there for you.
We've been asking you to join our conversation online, and here is what you've been saying to us. Starting off with Jamie. She says, I need to educate myself, and she asks us to please keep the conversation going because knowledge is power, and power leads to change. Let's go to Cheryl in Richmond. Cheryl said, no, I take that back. This is Scott. So Scott is responding to the comment we had earlier from the gentleman in Gilroy, Sean, and the professor also had, I think, the same tact as Scott here. He says, I 1,000% disagree with Sean from Gilroy. Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. All right, and then we're going to finish here with Javier Gonzalez in San Francisco. So Javier's comment basically was talking a little bit about how the conversation he thought was one-sided, but he also talked about how there are other groups in the country that he feels aren't part of the conversation. Specifically, though, he referenced the working class. And I'm curious for you guys, do you think it's appropriate to have a conversation about class at the same time we're having a conversation about race?
I think maybe he's referring more to socioeconomic issues, because if we were looking at issues of Latinos and blacks and some of those, it is sometimes a working class because there is such an economic divide in this country. And I think maybe that's what he's referencing to in terms of, we've been seeing it, lower paying jobs, jobs that don't have insurance. We've been seeing it during this pandemic, access to education, access to proper housing, access to health care, which we're going to be talking about next.
So it is almost one big conversation, but we've talked about that in different series that we have had here. So I mean, certainly it is a part of the conversation,
and probably something that we need to explore a little deeper also, to kind of talk about that, just as we talk about bringing other voices in, other minority voices in, also to talk about this. Okay, something for us to keep on the table here as we continue our conversations. You write that down, Marcus. Okay, well, she loves science and she loves wine. Dr. Chris Wakira is pairing her two great passions to help fill what she says are the gaps in the system. Frustrated what she saw in healthcare and in the wine industry, she got involved. Dr. Chris Wakira Chira meets us from Stanford Health and the CEO of her wine company. So, thank you for being here. On the surface, it seems like those are very separate passions, but really when you examine them closer, there are a lot of parallels when it comes to access, race, and exclusivity.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and sort of one of the underlying foundational issues across both industries is, as you mentioned, access, and also the inequities that have both industries, both the wine industry and healthcare, and so these underlying inequities that have been plaguing this industry for generations. And when it comes to healthcare, it's just access to facilities, to hospitals themselves, to the treatment modalities, to how to the points of disease that most African Americans sort of interface with the healthcare industry, to the distrust that we have with the healthcare industry. And then when it comes to the wine industry, is the underrepresentation as far as winemaking is concerned. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. We are more on the consumer aspect of it. But because of lack of either funding or education opportunities, we are not represented in sort of the winemaking, the sommelier aspects of the industry.
Let's talk about you being a doctor. Blacks make up only 5% of the doctors in the United States. Whites make up 56%. Right. So the impact on the country as a whole is obviously significant, but it's especially significant to communities of color where they don't have access. Right. And this pandemic has actually even put more of a spotlight on that, on the disproportionate burden of the virus on Hispanics and blacks.
Absolutely. And just to point out, so I'm a doctor of nursing practice, so I'm not an MD, I'm a DNP. And so, but with that being said, there are only about 10% of African Americans in the nursing field as well. So there's 5% of physicians, but there's also only 10% of nurses. And what that does to the community is I talked about distrust, because there's sort of historical issues of how the African American community has interacted with the healthcare industry. And when you don't see yourself represented in your care providers, in the physicians and the nurses that are taking care of you at the bedside, there's a gap in the rapport that you build with those clinicians, but there's also a gap, distrust in what the care that you're receiving. And there are nuances in the healthcare industry that are not as obvious to folks who are not in the community. I'll give an example. One of the common examples that we give is pain medication. A lot of times when an African American patient is in a hospital and asks for pain medication, they may be considered drug seeking, because we're supposed to be able to withstand pain and be able to tolerate pain a lot better than most communities. But that may not be the case.
Right. So let's talk about the wine industry, because there's even less representation there. I mean, only 1/10 of 1% of winemakers are owners in the wine industry, and the wine industry is huge. So it must feel extremely lonely in that pour room.
It absolutely is, and especially being a female black winemaker, it's absolutely a much smaller minority. The funding aspect of it, the distribution aspect of it. So when I came into this industry, those are one of the two main things. So I went out to Napa, Sonoma regions, and I was enjoying building community over bottles of wine, but I saw as completely underrepresented when it came to the service behind the counters and the folks who were making these wines. We were just nowhere to be seen, and I could not find wines that complemented my cuisine. My Kenyan cuisine. I'm Kenyan American, and I needed to find wines that complemented my mother's and my grandmother's cuisine. And so I came into this industry wanted to craft a wine that did that, but also wanting a wine that I could build community around, and also built a distribution network that would also distribute makers of color, women, and locals. And one of the locals that we distribute is actually who's hosting us today.
And finally tonight, do you have a hope that that's going to change now, given not only the conversation we're having about race in America, but also with now Kamala Harris being on the ticket, and people being able to see a very high-profile woman in a very high-profile position?
I'm very encouraged by that. I'm actually very encouraged. For one, sort of the symbolic nature of it is, I have a daughter, and for her to be able to see herself in sort of the second highest office in the country is incredible. But also for what it does to us women it makes us visible, right? And for me also just being here today to be able to speak to you about my experiences both in healthcare and in the wine industry as a black woman, an immigrant black woman, is incredible. So I'm very encouraged by it, and I do see a future. And with the Black Lives Movement, we've been a tremendous support for folks of color in a lot of different industries.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you so much.
Great conversation there. All right, well, they say if white people are part of the problem, then you should be part of the solution. Well, this one woman, she is working to bridge that gap of race inequity, and she's white. And it's happening right here in Silicon Valley. That part of the conversation coming up next.
John Lewis devoted his time on this earth fighting the very attacks on democracy and what's best in America that we're seeing circulate right now.
A friend in sunshine and storm, a friend who would walk the stony roads that he asked you to walk, that would brave the chastening rods he asked you to be whipped by.
His lesson for us is that we must all keep ourselves open to the hearing the call of love, the call of service, and the call to sacrifice for others.
It has been 2 weeks since friends, family, and past presidents that you saw there said goodbye to the late Congressman John Lewis. Lewis died July 17th after a battle with pancreatic cancer. Civil rights icon served more than 30 years representing Georgia in Congress. Now, he was one of the leaders who organized the 1963 March on Washington, and then 2 years later led a civil rights protest across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And that's where we saw his body carried across in a very significant moment, because it was by those, by the same law enforcement branch that beat him on that same bridge.
Right. You think about it, you know, we've heard the saying, be the change you want to see. He was that change. He fought until his death. And you know, I just saw this documentary earlier, and it talked about, you know, when does that fight end? That was a question asked. And the answer was, when you die.
Wow.
And he lived that.
Yeah. Trouble. He loved that word. Good trouble.
Yeah, that good trouble.
Good trouble. All right. Well, you have to show up. You have to take action. You have to make things stick in this moment. Some white leaders across the Bay Area are now leading uncomfortable conversations about race. Jenny Nicholas is one of them. She's the Chief Impact Officer at American Leadership Forum in Silicon Valley. Thank you for being with us. So I know you're very involved in the issue of race and equality. Do you get any pushback from blacks that feel you don't really walk in my shoes, you don't understand my struggle, so maybe you're really not the right person to lead? You should be, because we talk a lot here about listening instead.
I think that they're right, actually. I can't walk in their shoes. I don't know what they've dealt with. I can't begin to understand that. And I think that the role that white people need to play and what we need to do as white leaders is to step back and stand alongside communities of color and really understand what they need and want from us, and then behave in those ways that support the agendas and the things that they need and the things that they hold, and to really decenter ourselves as white people.
So let me ask you something, because you are leading a lot of stuff on the dialogue with other white leaders on the issue of racism. What is the biggest stumbling block when it comes to whites? There's a lot of white, very educated people that think they're very, very woke, but they don't seem to realize, though, that they may have an inherent bias as well, right?
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge in entering into these conversations is for people to set aside their desire to say it's not me. That can't be me. Yeah. And to really set aside and be in a place of being really uncomfortable and understand that actually it is you, because you are part of the system that is creating the oppression. And to be a true ally, what we have to do is really think about understanding the fact that we are a part of the system that is creating oppression, and then be willing to stand alongside people and work to end that oppression.
That takes a lot of
means
self-reflection.
that we have to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, and a lot of self-reflection. That a lot of people aren't willing.
I don't think there's shortcuts to this work.
Yeah. It's very intimidating to have those conversations. We've talked about it here. People are sometimes very hesitant. So why did you decide to start these conversations with other people?
Well, it's really important to us when we work with leaders at American Leadership Forum that we are providing all of the opportunities for them to stretch and grow and learn and be at their edges and be uncomfortable. For me personally, I can't not do this. If I'm going to be a part of the work that changes this community, if I believe that our liberation is tied to each other, that everyone who becomes liberated needs everyone else to become liberated, then I have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And, honestly, is that not okay for me to do? Absolutely it is. How uncomfortable is it for people of color every single day just to walk down the street, go into a park, drive their car, pick up their children, do day-to-day things that simply never bother me or even cross my mind? So I think I can live with that discomfort, and what I want to do is create spaces and containers where people can learn how to be in discomfort and learn together.
We apologize, we're hearing some noise in the background. Jenny, do you feel that we're really at a moment where white people really want to genuinely do this and genuinely learn, or are we at a moment where people are like, they're playing lip service because in this moment in time in history, it is the right thing to do and they want to be on the right side? Maybe if they don't even really want to do it, it's just, okay, I'm going to hedge my bets.
Well, for the folks that I'm working with, I believe they're in the first group, Jessica. They are running to be in that space of learning, growing, and being uncomfortable, and they're seeking out these conversations. And obviously, there are always going to be people that will take advantage of a moment, use it for their good. But for the work that we're doing and the work that I'm seeing, I feel like there's a lot of sincere desire for that to look different and to be different.
And for the rest of us and the people that you meet along the way, what do you tell them is the right way to be an ally to people of color in this moment?
I think it's really important to understand the difference between being an ally and a savior. It's important to understand that communities of color are powerful, strong, self-determining people, individuals, and communities, and they're not looking for a bunch of white people to rush in and save them. What they're looking for are for people to stand next to them as allies, hold their hands, be linked with their arms, and say, I will put myself on the line with you. I will be here for you. You don't need to be saved. You're fantastic just as you are. I'm here to be an ally with you, and I will fight those oppressive systems because I'm a part of the problem that created it.
Jenny Nicholas, we appreciate all the work you're doing and for being with us as well. Marcus, that's such a good point that she made that, because we have had this conversation here before, and we have had other black leaders on here with us who have said the same thing. We don't need them to lead.
Right.
We just need them to stand by us. We can lead on our own, and this is our fight, and we want to be the ones pushing the agenda.
Absolutely. I love what you were asking her. The thing about it is sometimes you have to be willing to be wrong, even when you think you're right. Because in that situation, it really is about learning. It's about change. That is all difficult for a lot of people to deal with. And sometimes you think you're doing that. My heart is in the right place.
Right.
But maybe my actions aren't.
But if you don't have the experience, you're just,
exactly.
it's ignorance. It's maybe not maliciousness, but it's definitely
and that's true.
ignorance.
And I think people understand that. But what you have to be willing to do is you have to be willing to understand that, to say, okay, maybe I am wrong. Let me step back and observe.
Right.
And what you need me to do.
And reflect. And take it in and take, yeah.
Yeah, you know,
that was good.
Yeah, a lot of people having those conversations. And actually, you know, we've been getting a lot of feedback from a lot of people online about this social media platform blowing up right now. Chris Gamora has been monitoring that for us today. And so, Chris, what are people saying now?
Well, Marcus, we've got something here from Chandra Hines in Vallejo, essentially tapping into what you were talking about, Jessica, just now. She says, why does it seem like most people are just now getting it or acknowledging racism in America after 400 years? The online conversation, like most conversations, does have tentacles. It's going lots of different directions. We talked about other races. Other people are talking about the classism, and then we also have some politics. We did talk about Joe Biden picking Kamala Harris at the top of the show. Marv has something to say about that. He is a black man. He says Harris and Biden need to beg to black and brown males. They locked too many of us up. Now, Farouk takes us back to the conversation at large. And what he says here is a criticism, I believe, and I'm wondering what you guys think about this. He says there is no tolerance for uncomfortable conversations in the Bay Area, way too much racial sensitivity. Well, Marv, here we are talking about it. I'm curious what you guys think. Are we too sensitive in the Bay Area to have this conversation, frankly, honestly, and raw?
I don't think so.
Well, I think maybe what he's referring to is that I think there are some people that are afraid to either ask uncomfortable questions for fear that they may be labeled racist, or maybe they don't understand it completely and they say things. So I think what he's saying is maybe there are moments where we're too politically correct, if I'm interpreting him,
I think you're right.
And that if we say something that's deemed politically incorrect, that then we're labeled racist. And you know, I think that's very common in when you have a familiar relationship with someone, right? People can say things about you that other people cannot, right?
So true.
And so I think there is a way. How do we tread through that? Who's allowed to say what to whom? You know, that's a big conversation for another time because, you know, another Hispanic might be able to say something to me or we say it about each other.
Exactly.
That, you know, all of a sudden would be uncomfortable if somebody else said.
Yeah, you know, I can talk about my sister, but you better not talk about my sister. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think it is like that, but I think it is a part of the conversation. And if it is not uncomfortable, you're probably not having a real conversation about it. Yeah. Because this is like, we've heard this time and time again. Every time we talk and have this conversation, we hear about it being uncomfortable. Right. And I think,
will we ever get to the point
case,
where it's not uncomfortable?
You know, I think I don't know about in our lifetime. Maybe, you know, I mean, maybe the next generation coming up, the younger people, when I say younger, I mean 10 and under, maybe not for them. But I think right now there is so much that we have to continue, so many walls that we have to continue to break down.
To catch up on.
Exactly. And I mean, in education, the history books, I mean,
there's a lot of work to be done.
A lot of work indeed. Well, you know what, we're going to continue our work right here with this conversation. So Hip Hop for Change, the Bay Area community organizer, helping kids work through their social and economic disadvantages. That part of the conversation when we come back.
bro, we gotta plant some justice, grow some seeds, dig in the earth for these groceries. I gotta promote the culture for those in need. Yo, the world's got folks to feed, right? We gotta plant.
That's Khafre Jay during a TED Talk event. This was a few years ago. He's actually the founder of Hip Hop for Change. It's a grassroots group educating children in oppressed communities using rap, breakdance, and DJing. He actually grew up in San Francisco's Hunter Point, saying that, you know what, it's San Francisco, but it's not necessarily the tourist spot that a lot of people come to the city to see. Khafre Jay joining us now. Khafre, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. How's it going today, Marcus?
You know, I'm feeling good right now. And you know what? I'm happy about this conversation because I know when I was talking to you earlier, you know, I said I think when we talk about kids, we really have to talk about what's being done and what we can do in helping that, because this really is our future and we have to set them up to succeed. So you're doing exactly that with your organization, Hip Hop for Change, since 2013. I want you to talk to us about that and how this all got started.
Well, you know, I'm a local hip hop artist, and the community that I experience is much different from what we see on television. I just got to break it down. First off, we've got 3 corporations that own 90% of the depiction of hip hop culture: Time, Sony, and Warner Music Group. Right now, 70% of the consumer base for hip hop is suburban white college-age men between 18 and 24. And they're being sold a bill of goods, and that's pretty much taking all the air out of the room. Most of hip hop doesn't look like it looks on television. And I think there's one thing that I said to you earlier, you know, Taco Bell. A lot of people eat Taco Bell, but they don't think Taco Bell represents Mexican culture or Mexican cuisine as a whole. And when we have these corporations that sell the same thing that all American media sells, sex, drugs, and violence, they're only picking a small portion of the hip hop community. And to a lot of people outside of our community, it seems like that's all hip hop is, but it's so much more. So not only does this inform the way people who don't live in Hunters Point, how they treat us, how they look at us, and what opportunities they then give us. But I think more importantly, it determines what kind of efficacy our young kids who are hip hop culture, what kind of understanding of their own culture that they have. And that's really important. So, you know, I formed this because I'm tired of a beautiful set of people that I live with, that I work with, that I perform with, that we spit out our hopes and dreams. I'm tired of them working so hard and not being able to earn a paycheck from their artistry. I'm tired of young kids not having the idea that they can go to Carnegie Hall with their cultural expressive forms instead of thinking that they have to do something else that's not so close to home. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. You know, and you said Carnegie Hall. I remember I actually got to sing in Carnegie Hall when I was like 15 years old. That is a cool experience. So, you know, the fact that you're providing a pathway to that, I mean, you know what, that's an amazing thing. So I want to talk about hip hop though, because, you know, for me, hip hop really is poetry with music. It really is a storytelling. It is about a people. It is about a culture. And a lot of people misread it sometimes when you hear about what you hear on the radio with rap and, you know, the cars, the jewelry, the women, the money. But hip hop really is a history lesson, if you will. If you look at some of the true essence of hip hop.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And first off, I just got to say, like, if people are looking at, you know, corporate representations of Black and brown culture, that's never worked in the history of this nation. You know, I don't think corporate media has ever really represented Black and brown struggle, hopes, dreams, happinesses, joys, fears, and whatnot in a realistic way ever. So why are we expecting them to do so now? I don't think they are. But you know, the most important thing that we need to know is hip hop is a vehicle. It's one that our kids are primed already to use. You know, whether kids are hip hop cultured or hip hop curious, they want it. You know what I'm saying? So we might as well, you know, use that vehicle for whatever kind of empowerment we possibly can.
And let's talk about the vehicle that you're doing right now with the kids. I want to talk about the ways you're educating them, and talk about the ways that you are teaching them about their culture and their history through the art of hip hop. Do you think it's better than what they're learning in the history books?
Well, given the fact that our history books aren't really representative of most of the people in my community's culture in a real way, I do think that hip hop education and culturally responsive pedagogy can be way more conducive to sparking imagination and putting kids on a pathway for learning. You know, one of our artists that we work with, Kiana Selena from LA, she said, yeah, they had our ancestors, but we have their kids. And that's true. You know what I'm saying? I think a lot of the times in classrooms, we have people fighting to get kids to focus on STEM. I don't really have a problem getting kids to rap about, you know, what's on their mind, you know, and especially when we're dealing with populations of youth of color that have 50% less access to art and artistic expression in schools because of systemic structures of racism. It's a no-brainer to use something like hip hop that really costs nothing. It costs as much as a pencil and a piece of paper for me to put out some raps. And some kids don't even use paper to write stuff down. They just think it all up in here.
Right.
So when I see this kid walking down the street and they're, you know, mouthing rhythmically and wording, I see genius. I don't see what a lot of people see when they're not from our community. Hip hop to me is expression. It's a beautiful vehicle.
And you do it through so many avenues, breakdance, graffiti, and all that. But I want to talk about what you're doing now with the studio that you're trying to build to really give kids that ability to express themselves through music. And you're trying to do this where they have to pay nothing. So talk about what you're doing with that.
So our program, we go in K through 12. We've taught 22,000 kids in the last 7 years the history of hip hop and how to engage and express themselves. But then we leave, and kids are, you know, they have a bunch of raps. We also work with kids in incarcerated situations, group homes and whatnot, and they all have the same deal. They want to express, they want to have that efficacy of having a EP or a CD or getting their music out or just having the experience of recording. And a lot of the nonprofit studios in the Bay Area that are available to youth, they have to do they have to jump through so many hoops and hurdles in order to get that studio time. For a lot of these youth, going to the studio is the transformative thing, and expressing and being able to, you know, be introspective and put that on an album and show people it's great for their self-esteem and self-efficacy. So, you know, because of all this George Floyd stuff, we got a little bit of support, more than we normally got, and we are building a studio right now. An amazing space that's going to help kids record for free under 24. They don't have to jump through any hoops, no bells, no whistles. And we're also going to undercut the market for people who are over 24 so we can start getting some of that intergenerational communication. Kids are hungry. And if we can show them a pathway to be successful with their own cultural expression, it's just wild. You know, I don't know if you've seen a room full of second graders rap battle or breakdance. But once you do, you realize how powerful of a tool hip hop is and how much these kids are ready to use that vehicle to take them to a higher platform, higher place, and a higher plane of thinking.
Absolutely. You know, the studies have been saying that, you know, music really is a way to help educate kids, allow them to express themselves. And I want to thank you for what you're doing. And if you want to help out with that, make sure you look it up, Hip Hop for Change. That is Coffrey J joining us. Coffrey, thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Be well.
Hip hop is such a bridge too,
It
because
really is.
you've got the kids. You know, he's talking about black kids, but it's been such a bridge for white kids too.
Yeah,
it's what's engaged them to be, in many respects, want to know more about the black culture because it's become synonymous with you know.
That's how they're learning so much about it.
Exactly.
And like he was just saying, typically the biggest consumer of hip hop, rap music would be, as far as spending the money, is going to be white males between, I think it was like 15 to 24 years old. So certainly they're learning what these rappers and artists are really talking about.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we've been getting a lot of feedback on our social media platforms as we've been doing. Let's check in one more time with Chris Kimura.
All right, yeah, let's follow that music theme because we have different ways that our viewers are getting themselves educated and getting involved. One of them involves music. We're going to start with a more traditional method, though, with Tamika Smith, who writes in and says, a few Bay Area moms and I have gotten together and sent open letters to our local police chiefs, mayors, and city council members. Now, let's get to the music. Eric Hales wrote us, and he says, I am near completion of a project that deals directly with prejudice, police brutality, and unjustifiable police shootings of unarmed citizens. What is that project? He says it's a Broadway-style play called And Justice For, and one of the songs is called Black Lives Matter. He says he's working on it, so look for it. Eric Hales, that's the guy who's putting that together. All right, we're having a conversation about race, and we're going to talk about a Karen. This is a Karen who says from Sonoma that she wants you to listen to her podcast, A Karen and a Black Businesswoman. Our conversation is direct, emotional, and honest. She says they talk about everything essentially that we're talking about right here in podcast format. So I'm curious, what do you guys recommend for getting yourself involved, getting yourself educated, and educating others?
I like the fact that Karen was saying about that. Listen to the conversation. If you have them talking about something, sometimes it is like being the fly on the room in that situation. So you're the door is kind of open for you to kind of get more insight of what's going on. So I think that's a good way. Just listening, we've been saying that listening is one of the many ways you can do, but listening to a podcast, if they're talking about issues like that.
The podcast is so great. There's so many activists and people that you can learn from. Yeah, I go on my hike, I put on a podcast all the time, and I'm walking the whole time having to stop and take notes. So my hiking is not going as well, but also reading the books. We've been putting out books, there's a list of books that you can read. You don't know what you don't know sometimes.
You don't.
And so it is now imperative that you take that movement. If you want to learn how to do something, you got to read it or you got to do it. So
educating yourself about it.
No matter, same thing with racism, and it really wakes you up as to being like, oh, I see that.
I didn't know
get that now.
Yeah.
I get that now.
Yeah, and a podcast, I know we've talked about it around here, 1619. It's a great podcast to start out with if you're looking for something to just listen to. I listened to it in the car, and every time I drove somewhere, I would listen to it, and it was just very insightful. It's a good one to watch, or listen to, I should say.
Yeah, we'll be right back.
My people, they dying, they dying. The song that I performed is called Corrupt. It was about gentrification, oppression, and discrimination. My city is gentrified. Slippery slope, like we live on a slip and slide. I wrote this song way before George Floyd. I wrote it like 8 to 12 months ago. And it was just something that I had to get off my chest because I felt that people need to hear it. We all on different sides.
Okay, highlighting the voices of Black Lives Matter protesters right there. You're looking at that. Digital video journalist Jonathan Bloom gathered their stories and their songs. You can watch them right now. Point your phone to that QR code at the bottom left of your corner on the screen. It'll take you right to that video essay.
All right. Well, you know what? Juneteenth is now a formally recognized holiday in Santa Clara County. So this week, the Board of Supervisors unanimously approving that proposal, declaring Juneteenth a county-wide holiday starting next year. It commemorates the emancipation of enslaved people right here in the U.S. It was first celebrated in Texas in 1865, like 2.5 years almost after the Emancipation Proclamation. Santa Clara County is now just one of a handful of counties nationwide officially recognizing that day.
And I think we had the conversation about Juneteenth here maybe a month ago about the lack of recognition for that. So we can see slowly there are incremental changes that are happening even within the last 6 weeks that we've been having this conversation about, race in America.
Absolutely. And the thing about Juneteenth, it is heavily celebrated here in the Bay Area, which, there's one in San Jose, Oakland, as well as San Francisco. They have them every year. And I've had the pleasure of actually hosting the Juneteenth Festival in San Jose for the past 3 years. And even this year, it was virtual. So, it's such a celebration and a time to celebrate because it's done with music, it's done with art, it's done with food. Everything within the Black community is really celebrated out there. And because you think about
We've seen some companies start to recognize it as well.
Absolutely. And now that we're talking about it, more people are listening, and now we know.
And more people know about it. All right, Chris.
All right, so our conversation has gone lots of different directions all over the map. One common thread, though, schools. Trishelle, I think we're going to end with yours, and you wrap it up nicely. We have to start with early childhood education. How early, you guys think?
I think it should start in kindergarten.
Yeah, I think before then. Whenever they can understand talk. I mean, you know, it's just kind of like little things here and there, kind of how we learn everything. It's a part of our history, everyone's history.
But do you think that little kids, when you see babies together, babies don't really see color. I think it's once you start getting into school, or maybe they do, I'm not sure, but I think, I don't think most children, when they're early, I mean, isn't racism something that you learn?
It is something that's learned. It may not be learned in your house, but it could be learned through society, how we see things on television, how we hear things on the radio. So we have to get to our kids early as possible to teach them about just loving everyone. And it's not seeing color, because you can't help but see color, but it's really understanding that, we're all going to be different, but love each other, love us all. Like, we are as equal, they are as equal as we are, she is as equal as he is. We have to teach that as early as possible.
Yeah, I agree with you. It should start early and be consistent.
Yes, and we cannot let up on that. It is going to be tough sometimes, especially because a lot of us don't know how to do it yet.
Yeah. Let's talk quickly. I know we only have a couple of seconds. We heard Professor Taylor say if someone's just that, unable to move in their position, should you just ignore that person and move on? Because we keep saying have a conversation.
Right.
But what if you can't have a conversation?
Well, look, I look at it this way. At this point, if you're still saying all lives matter when we're explaining that Black Lives Matter does not mean just black lives, then maybe you just don't want to be a part of the change. Maybe you have to look in the mirror and realize that you are fighting against what is happening right now. It's a change for better. It's a change for equality. And if you can't say Black Lives Matter, you don't truly mean that all lives matter.
On that note, we say goodnight. That's a powerful statement, Marcus.
Well, we got to keep the conversation going.
And I have to say, I love doing